Okay, hello everyone. And on this week's DRAT Podcast, we're going to be having a little bit of a discussion. I'm once again joined by Trish and David. And we're going to be talking a bit about, well, first we're going to talk about what we like about the poems, what qualities draw us to the poems we like. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about when writing our own poetry, what goes through our heads, how we go about writing our poetry, and whether we take any of those characteristics that we like about our favorite poems and try to incorporate them into our own. So hello, David and Trish.
Hello there.
Morning.
So when it comes to your favorite poems, well, first of all, what do you like about your favorite poems? What draws you to a poem? What makes it your favorite?
Well, okay, I'll go first if I may. I don't think I've got a favourite poem. I've got a collection of poems, actually, and that triggers me off with what I like about poetry is, you can have an eclectic mix. Poetry doesn't have to be one particular item or subject or anything like that. I draw things from all over the place, actually, very often through everyday experiences or suddenly hearing something, a point that Trish made last week about, suddenly something triggers you off and things like that. I would say, for example, today I've brought along a poem by Dylan Thomas called Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is a very, very famous poem and is really against raging against old age. But the reason why I know about this, it goes back to almost, I think, the 1970s or 1980s. And there was a program on television called The Chinese Detective with an actor by the name of David Yip. And he used to quote poetry all over the place during his, inquiries. And he came up against, a crusty old individual. And he quoted this thing at the person, I forget, it is a famous actor, but I can't remember his name. But he started saying, do not go gentle into that good night. And the response of this guy was, you bloody poetry, get away with you. That's a bunch of abuse and things like that. So that, that stuck in my mind of the actual poem itself. So really, it's a sort of mixture of things, from the Shakespearean things, which are sort of fine use of English wordage and things like that, Rabbie Burns and things. To me, it's an eclectic mix of things, of all sorts of things that you gadfly about and pick up from various places. It can be on one particular subject, but to me, it doesn't have to be really. And of course, humour as well is always very, very good indeed in poetry.
Yeah. What about yourself, Trish?
I'd agree with David. I don't have a favourite poet. I like to just, it's the mood of the day, the mood of the week, how it captures you. I like to get stuck into something and I like it to make sense. I like to feel it and get right into it. I like depth to poetry, but I do like an eclectic mix like David. I can't say I just like this or I just like that style or I like that poet. I like all sorts of different things for all sorts of different reasons. That's about it.
See, that's interesting because I think I'm a little bit funny with poetry. I like particular characteristics, like, for example, alliteration. In one of my favorite poems by Robert Frost, it's called The Vantage Point. If tired of trees, I seek again mankind. Like in that first line, tired and trees provides that alliteration. And he uses that quite a bit in his poetry, which is one of the reasons why he's one of my favorite poets. But I like the use of similes as well. But I think one of the things I really like is how I can relate to a poem like that. It's really about, like, The Vantage Point by Robert Frost is about, it's told from the perspective of an animal, but it could easily apply to a person who's on the fringe of society, who's just, because it's about this, the speaker of the poem, who's most likely an animal, watching this town and watching the people go by, and then when he grows bored with that, he turns and he finds the creator of an ant and starts watching that. And I think it's quite interesting because, like, obviously this animal could easily be a person who is in isolation and, feels like is a bit of an outcast. And I think, at times I think we all get that feeling. So, where we're very, sometimes a bit alone and not, we're on the fringe of society ourselves. I think everybody gets that feeling. So that's something, I found I could relate to that. And so for me, that's one thing I like about poems, or one of the qualities I have, when I look at all my favorite poems, I can relate to them in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's good to be able to relate to them. I agree. I like to really get the feel of something, and it can be all sorts. It can be a romantic poem, it can be a factual poem, it can be something that's actually relevant to what's happening in your life or what's happening in the world. But it's not just one theme. It can be all sorts of things, anything.
Yeah.
As long as you can really get to grips with it and understand it and get into the head almost of the reader. I like to really understand and get deep into things.
It must be difficult actually from the writer's point of view as well to try and accomplish that with the poem, to try and get, because you said about getting into the reader's head. You have to have a very good understanding of not a very good understanding. You have to have a decent understanding of life itself, if you want to write something that...
Yes.
I don't know what I want to say. I might cut that bit out,
I think the reason I'm like that...
Turn to poetry.
Go on, Trish, what were you going to say?
Well, I like black and white. I like to be an all yes person, all no, black and white, no grey areas. So it's got to make sense. And I don't know whether black and white is a best way of explaining it, but I don't like the grey areas. I don't. If there's questions and I can't answer them, then I get a bit frustrated by that, and maybe would try to understand either with a discussion with somebody or read more about it and try to sort of ascertain what it really did mean, what the meaning was. But it is important to me to understand, and then I can say, yes, I really like it, or no, it's not for me. There's no in between.
Right.
So that's really interesting, actually. So would you say then that a poem that isn't very clear, so you say, falls into that grey area category, so it might be a little bit ambiguous, only presents maybe some questions and doesn't necessarily provide any answers, would you say that's a bad poem? Or do you think it's just down to taste for you?
Oh, definitely. I think it's down to taste. I mean, what is something that I wouldn't like, the next person would like. So everybody's different. Art is in the eye of the beholder, and so is poetry. And so yes, no, just because I don't like it, I don't expect everybody else not to like it, sort of thing. And so it's a very individual, unique thing. I would say.
Well, just let me have my sixpence now, because just to lighten the whole sort of discussion, I suppose, really. I've done another poem which is a self-indulgent one, basically, but this is from the element of fun, say, because I think I mentioned yesterday that we went to IKEA last Saturday, and spent an incredible length of time in the shop and queuing up. So I did actually do a poem about that, which I thought was a fun thing to do. And really, in a sense, it was self-indulgent, actually, though it might strike a chord with people when listening to it and think, oh, God, yeah, I can relate to that. So I did a short poem about it, Cleo and David visit IKEA. Well, I'll read it. I'm itching to read it, so I'll do it now.
Go on.
Yeah, definitely.
The build-up, drum roll, everything. The aim was to buy a shoe cabinet, which was a belated birthday present for Sam, her son, by the way. We recently had a lockdown break in wheeze. Indeed, we thought naively it would be a breeze. We decided to visit the famous Swedish IKEA and thus joined the queue towards the rear. For 40 minutes we stood patiently outside, social distancing of course, or woe betide. And then the breakthrough did famously appear. The entrance to the store was definitely near. In we went, all keen and avid, though following the one-way system, we soon became ragged. Families crisscrossed our chosen path, staff brushed by us, were they having a laugh? Section upon section passed us by, bedrooms, tables and plates stacked high. Our will to live began rapidly to sag, though thankfully we found our chosen item, whoopee, it's in the bag. Next to the checkout counters with the thronging crowd, payment by card is, of course, very much allowed. Through the exit and into fresh air, just in time to stop utter despair. Our tired bodies headed for the car. DRAT! I've parked it stupidly afar. We loaded up and got ready to go. Is this the future of retail? I don't bloody think so. The end of the time.
Oh, that was great.
I think you should send it to IKEA.
Yes, their customer relations department, dear sir. Yes, thank you for your.
You'll get a ban for life.
Yes.
Yeah.
No more meatballs for you, basically.
Yeah. Meat or vegetarian.
Yeah, well, yes, right.
And so is the next chapter when I went to B&Q, because that's where you headed to next, wasn't it?
I did. Well, we did B&Q first of all, actually, which was a 25-minute wait. And I suppose I could really do, actually, you could do something similar for B&Q, to be honest with you. You know, unfathomable one-way systems and things like that, not knowing your way around, people crisscrossing all over your path, and so on, basically. Yes. So that was our Saturday, basically. But not to be repeated tomorrow.
So you mentioned something that was quite interesting prior to reading that you wrote it purely, it was a self-indulgent poem. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's easier to write poems that are, you know, self-indulgent, or do you think it's easier to write poems that are maybe... Well, no, actually, my first question is, do you think poems turn out better when you write them just for yourself rather than for other people?
I suppose it's really what audience you're going to sort of aim at, really. I'll say this was really a self-indulgent one. We might put it on the podcast, you know, and a few people will listen to it and they give a wry smile. That's fine for me, basically. Yeah. And I think it all depends on your mood. You know, I was in a sort of fairly light-hearted mood. I thought, and we've joked an awful lot about it, Claire and myself, about it. You know, she has similar views to me. So I just thought, just be a bit of a laugh, basically. And really, an outside audience didn't really come into it. But, you know, sorry.
Yeah. No, you go. You could continue.
Yeah, so an outside audience didn't really come into it. I just thought it was a fun thing to do, basically. You know,
did that make it easier for you to write the poem? Do you feel less conscious? Because I find when I'm writing and I think, you know, I'm writing this for other people, I become very self-conscious, and I end up doing more drafts, and I get a bit more critical of myself.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'd say if you're doing something maybe about deep emotions, you know, things that you feel and things like that, and you're giving out a message or something like that, then I think you adapt yourself for the audience, really, and you put yourself in a different position completely. You know, this is the whole point where we came to, really, we're going round in the circle. It's the eclectic thing about poetry. You know, you can have fun, you can have emotion, it can be enigmatic, which is obviously not the black and white, which Trish is talking about, but it's still enigmatic nonetheless. Because I'll say many songs are based on, you know, slightly enigmatic. What do they mean and things like that.
Yes, they can have a double meaning.
Yes, absolutely right. Yeah, indeed. So that was my approach.
I think when I'm writing poetry, the main thing is that you get into it because you know what you're going to do. You have an idea of what it's going to be about or whatever, but it's the time. As long as you're not pressured by anything, then things come naturally. If you've got a pressure of time, I think that spoils what you're trying to achieve. And you usually if I've got pressure of time and I'm having to do something, I'll quickly do it. And then when I go back to it, I think that's a load of rubbish and start again. And when I've got that time, it flows. And I don't know whether that's just me. I've also got to have a clear table and no background noise.
Right. Precondition.
Yeah. I mean, see, I'd make the argument that writing for I agree with you about time being a pressure, but I'd say another pressure is writing for another audience. So I'm just wondering whether first and foremost, poetry should always be a personal thing. You know, you should always be writing for yourself first and foremost, and then obviously maybe you just tidy it up and make it a bit presentable when you want to present it to other people. I don't know. I find that quite interesting.
Well, you're writing it, so it is your personal poem, isn't it? And it's going to have your personal touches on it. You're going to adapt that to whatever it is you're writing about and making it personal to the subject. But the framework starts with the poet, and that is you. So there's two personal touches to it. One is the writer, and one is the reader or the audience, possibly.
So when do you start thinking about the audience and the reader, though?
Well, it would depend on the poem that you're writing about. I mean, when I've done funny poems like the ones David, the one that David's just read out to us, I did one about experiences in lockdown, and you think, I suppose you think less about the funny things because it is, like David said, indulgent. So you can put anything in it. But if it's a more sensitive issue that you're writing about, you've got to be more thoughtful, I think, and sympathetic to whatever it is you're doing, the topic.
Yeah.
But equally, you need to get the point across. And I think we mentioned it last week, Seamus Heaney with the poem about a stillborn. I mean, that is a very, very hard, I think I would have thought, very hard to put into poetry and to give to the person who has just lost a baby. Because that could be misconstrued totally. But how he did it, how he wrote it was just so eloquent, so beautiful that the recipient treasured it, and it helped. It gave her great comfort.
But I imagine when it's writing something like that, I mean, I'd have to read the poem again, but I imagine when writing something like that, you couldn't really be self-indulgent at all in that. In fact, it is purely you're writing it purely for someone else, really. I mean, because there's no way you could... There's no way you could... Well, you don't know what it's like. There's no way you could make it about yourself at all. And if you did, I would even argue it's probably a little bit unethical, you know, if you made it about himself. So in that scenario, you're purely writing for an audience. So it'd be interesting actually to see. I think I'll have a little look into is it Seamus Heaney? Did you say his name was? Yeah. It'd be good to contrast two poems, one that is purely self-indulgent from his part, and then the one about the stillborn, and to see how the styles differ, and you know if there is a difference. I think that'd be quite an interesting thing to do. He's actually the poet of the week in the Yorkshire Post this week.
Strangely enough.
Very good.
Yeah, I'll have to read more of him. The only thing I've read of his was he rewrote Antigone by, I can't remember who originally wrote it, but his version was called The Burial of Thebes, which is quite good.
Okay. Yeah, I do like his poetry. I like his style. But it will be interesting. I think I'd like to do that too. I'd like to reread The Stillborn, and actually the one that he... was in the Yorkshire Post with is called Digging, and that's him looking out of his bedroom window watching his father dig the soil and plant the potatoes. And he sort of goes into great detail about how he is using the fork to dig the ground and to plant the potatoes, and all he's got is a pen in his hand, and he is then sort of I suppose being a little bit indulgent with that, because he's saying that his father is just a master with the fork, but he's the master with the pen, so he's going to stick with that.
Yeah.
That's quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it's symbolism, isn't it, really? And
yes, yeah, it is, yes.
Very, very good indeed. Yeah. Very good.
Mm.
Can I lighten the mood a little, and just throw in a bit of a wobbler? Because this is something that came out in Believe It or Not, and it has Peter Sellers' name behind it. If you remember the Beatles, they made a number one track called A Hard Day's Night. Yeah. And Peter Sellers decided to make it was part poetry and part song, but he decided to make a version of this. But it was in the Shakespearean version of Richard III and Laurence Olivier. And the words, I won't do the whole thing, but I'll give you the first two sort of verses and things like that. Because there was music behind it, but essentially it was poetry in the way that he did it. But anyway, I'll say, just listen to this, and I'll say it did get into the charts, believe it or not, but I'm not sure whether he recorded anything else. But anyway, here we go. It has been a hard day's night, and I have been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night, and I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do will make me feel all right. You know I work all day to get you money to buy you things, and it's worth it just to hear you say you're going to give me everything. So why on earth should I moan? Because when I get you alone, you know I feel okay. It went on like this with the background music and things like that, in the form of Laurence Olivier from Richard III, which just struck me as being funny at the time. But
Okay, so let's. Oh, there is one more thing I want to talk about as well when it comes to the writing process. If I could ask you to, how do you actually go about writing a poem? So, for example, for me, I actually use pen and paper. I can't. Although I love using a computer for other stuff, sometimes I write prose with a computer using Word. With poetry, I have to write it. I just have to write it with pen and paper. I don't know why that. I just prefer the process, I'm just wondering what you two do and what your thoughts on, paper versus computer, writing with a pen as opposed to typing.
That's really interesting because, you're the younger generation and yet you're still wanting pen and paper. I don't know about you, David, but I take notes. Like today, I'd be taking notes, pen and paper, but when I write poetry, it's straight onto the laptop. Because I think I'm always making mistakes, and I'll write a line and I think, oh yeah, that's good. Then I'll write the next line and think that's better, but that makes the first line no good. So I rewrite the first line and sort of do that. I'd go through trees if I did that with pen and paper. And my wrist would fall off. But that's really interesting that you're that way around. What do you do, David?
Well, I think probably I lean more towards Rob, actually, to be honest with you, which is that usually I get these thoughts not necessarily at a computer. They're either, as I've said before, I've suddenly had an epiphany early in the morning, basically, and I have to scroll it down on a piece of paper and things like that and develop it. And it probably develops a little while. And then after that, when I try to decipher my writing, I think, right, now is the time to put it on the computer, which is essentially what happens. And then you sit down on the computer, see whether it makes sense, pull it all together and things like that, and begin to refine it to a certain extent. So that tends to be my sort of modus operandi for trying to get the thing done.
Yeah, I do take a notepad and paper to bed with me, or because sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night, and I've said this to you before, and you suddenly have this perfect phrase or whatever has come to head, and you think, I'll remember it in the morning, but you don't. So it's good to write it down. But if I'm out and I've only got my phone, I'll put it onto my phone as well. So. the use of everything, I suppose, is good. So what kind of styles do we prefer then? Have we really gone into that?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, for me personally, I prefer the shorter poems. I quite like one of my favorite poets. Well, William Blake and Robert Frost are probably my two favorite poets.
I've actually got some poems that I copied down of Blake this week. He was a strange guy, wasn't he? He expanded the boundaries of poetry with language and visuals, and he was one of the first people to do that. And because of that, he was accepted. His poetry was very easy to read, and illiterate or not very well educated people could appreciate it more than high society, and high society really didn't want much to do with him. And because of the way he wrote the poems with illustrations as well as his writing, he was viewed a bit of it as an eccentric, and totally ignored. People thought he was, in his lifetime anyway, considered insane for his mystical Christian writings. And he ended up being buried in an unmarked grave.
Wow. Oh, wow.
But it was the poem. Have you read The Chimney Sweeper?
No.
What it is about small children, obviously not having a childhood. And he was very, his poems were grouped in together called Songs of Innocence. These were, anyway, Blake's Songs of Innocence were written largely from a child's viewpoint. When he revisited the Songs of Innocence much later on, the Songs of Innocence changed to be called the Songs of Experience, which basically was the Songs of Innocence, the child, the Songs of Experience, the adult. And so it's not very long, this poem, so I'll just give you a quick read. It's The Chimney Sweeper. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they ran, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and he rose in the dark, and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. And that was The Chimney Sweep.
Actually, on that note, can I read a William Blake poem as well?
Yeah.
Let me just hang on. This is my favourite of his, and it is called, let me find it. I saw a chapel all of gold. I think it's written in iambic tetrameter, and there's 4 verses. I saw a chapel all of gold, that none did dare to enter in, and many weeping stood without, weeping, mourning, worshipping. I saw a serpent rise between the white pillars of the door, and he forced and forced and forced down the golden hinges tall. Along the pavement sweet, set with pearls and rubies bright, all his slimy length he drew, till upon the altar white, vomiting his poisons out, on the bread and on the wine. So I turned into a sty, and laid me down among the swine. But and I know what you mean about him being, you know, he that's what makes poetry so powerful, is like you can use these simple words, a simple language, and convey these complex images and emotions. You know, I think William Wordsworth did the same as well. Was was that the same era as well as Blake? Because I think that's when it started. As you said, Blake was one of the first poets who used this simple language, who was, you know, rejected by that high society. I think you know, William Wordsworth was, I think it was, you know, quite similar, because he wrote in a very simple, you know, very simple style, very simple language. So I'm sure they were around the same time, you know. Yeah,
quite possibly.
Yeah. Let's see, what else do we need to touch on? Well, we touched on style. So David, you mentioned earlier humor being a big part of. How important is humor to poetry? If you come across, you know, can a poem be too serious for you? And if it is, do you reject it? Do you be like, oh no thanks?
Oh no, well no, I certainly wouldn't reject it. I'm say, particularly if they strike a chord. I think some of the poetry that Trish has written, for example, strikes a chord, and so I'm not dismissive or anything like that. I take it on board, and if it's got a deep meaning, then yes, I'm saying it's something to make you think about and things like that. And I've written one or two poems like that, but I suppose in terms of the style that I'm thinking about for myself is, you know, I tend to be humorous is the idea behind it, you know, just to sort of just to put a smile in people's face and things like that. Yeah. And you know, people like Ian Macmillan and Roger McGough do it on that style, basically. You know, it's a sort of it's humour. One is Scouse humour, one is Yorkshire humour as well. But I just like the idea of doing it. But it doesn't mean to say I would rule out anything. I have written one or two things, particularly about emotion and things like that, and so on. But really, I'm saying, I suppose, like I said last week, I was doing, you know, very much the easy way out, which is rhyming poetry, and 2 lines rhyming and things like that, on very often personal experiences. But no, I'm saying the things that I've chosen, you know, in terms of from Shakespeare to Dylan Thomas to Robert Burns and things like that, all of these strike a chord for a particular reason, really. Yeah. You know, either for their writing style or for what they're portraying and things like that, and so on. So it's eclectic, I suppose, really.
Comes back to the eclectic mix.
Yeah.
What about you, Trish? What's your thoughts on humour used within poetry?
Well, I am with David. I understand what he's saying, and I think there's a time and a place. And I think often something a bit quirky, something a bit that gives you a little bit of a smile, gets the point across better than being very serious. And it sort of jumps out of you a bit more. So I quite like that. Yeah. I think I would tend to be, possibly because of me, I'd like to be more on the humorous side, the quirky side, than the serious side. But equally, it's sometimes quite nice to read something that has a very deep and powerful meaning. And you've got to have a little bit of all of it, but I think I would tend to lean towards more humour and quirky.
I read something interesting this week. It was an article by critic James Wood, and he was writing about a French author. I think it was who wrote Madame Bovary. Was it Gustave? Is it Flaubert? No, you say his name. Anyway, he'd wrote this piece, and it was about this French author, and it was about realism. And one thing he said that all the great realist authors had in common was actually they mixed the serious with the comical. So they decided to mix both. So I think one of the examples used was Anton Chekhov short story. I think towards the end, this character dies, and it's all very serious and everything, but then he decides to describe the corpse, which has been wrapped in cloth, as a radish. It looks like a radish because it's big at the top and small at the bottom. It's quite funny. And, I think that's something that I'm going to try and incorporate into my own, because mine is, my poetry tends to be quite, I think, depressing at times. So I think I'm going to go for, my mission over the next couple of weeks is to write a poem that mixes seriousness with humour. See how it comes out.
Yeah, I think it's good to have something that will make you not necessarily laugh, but just to lighten the load a little bit. And especially with what we've been doing over the last few weeks, because everything around us is pretty heavy, and so a bit of lightness, a bit of a softer edge is something good.
I'll say I've got about. I'm not going to read it because it does take a bit of time to read, but I'll suggest, on this light-hearted mode, by a poem by a 20th century poet by the name of Patrick Barrington, who wrote a fair number of humorous sort of verses. And the one that I've got here, as I say, it's fairly long, so I'm not going to sort of do it now. But it's called The Diplomatic Platypus. And
it's brilliant.
And it really is quite funny. It really is quite funny. And, it's humorous, poking fun at things and things like that, and so on, poking fun at the diplomatic service. The whole nonsense of having a diplomatic platypus in itself, the title is something outrageous. It's just a fun thing to read through, and, it's a wry smile, and you feel... Are
you going to read a bit?
I'll read some of it if you wish. I didn't really want to take too much of your time, but okay, well, I'll start on it, I had a duck-billed platypus when I was up at Trinity, with whom I soon discovered a remarkable affinity. He used to live in lodgings with myself and Arthur Purvis, and we all went together for the diplomatic service. I had a certain confidence I own in his ability. He mastered all the subjects with remarkable facility. And Purvis, though more dubious, agreed that he was clever, but no one else imagined he had any chance whatever. I failed to pass the interview. The board, with the wry grimaces, took exception to my boots and then objected to my braces. And Purvis too was failed by an intolerant examiner who said he had his doubts about his sock suspenders' stamina. Our summary rejection, though, we took with urbanity, was natural wounding in some measure to our vanity. The bitterness of failure was considerably mollified, however, by the ease with which our platypus had qualified. And then the rest of the sentence go on about his triumphs on the diplomatic front until he actually did a big boo-boo later on by laying an egg. I think it was in the Bulgarian legation and had to be retired, basically. So, it's just a light-hearted, fun thing to read, basically, Yeah.
It's really funny you brought that one up, because my ex-husband did a play about that.
Did he really? Oh, wow.
He was in the army, and it sort of coincided with various things that he and his fellow whatevers were doing, and they were being chosen to go on to big things. Some did, some didn't, and they played that as a light-hearted play. To the officers' wives and audience or whatever, but to music, and it had a beat to it, and it was really good. It was really.
Oh, that is very, very interesting indeed. Actually, and I'm glad you've heard about it. Actually, I was that's very good indeed.
Strange how these come up.
Yeah, and I think that was his style, wasn't it? It was humorous things that he wrote. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, but it had a deeper meaning, because their deeper meaning was they were all very keen and young and wanting to get to the top of their chosen career, and some sadly fell by the wayside, and some were going up to the top, and some made terrible mistakes, ending in the egg at the end. And so that's really interesting that you bring that up.
because I think that, the message is, I'm saying, up until when the egg was laid, this platypus had done everything correctly. It didn't offend anybody, basically, in the diplomatic service or of our friends abroad, actually, and was lauded and lauded all over the place. And then one particular incident, and whoosh, end of his career, basically.
Yes, as easy as that. But I also like with Seamus Heaney, he is sort of a naturalist, and he loves nature, and it gets right into what's out there, and you can feel and you can see everything. I mean, the scaffolding wasn't nature, the poem that I read last week, but it was about structure. And it really did have you felt the structure, and it made sense. And then it had the hidden meaning of you were building the scaffolding, you were making something strong. The relationship was going through a bit of a bad patch, but you'd put the scaffolding up, so you'd built your strong wall. And you can sort of interlink the words and behind the words, which I like personally.
Yeah, that's well put, definitely. Yeah.
Anything else we'd like to touch on?
Well, I've got a poem here by Byron that I picked out for this week, if you want to hear it.
Yes, please.
It's not
just to interject, Trish, Byron's ancestral home, by the way, is well worth a visit, Rob.
Really?
It's located to the north of Newstead Abbey.
Okay.
And Newstead Abbey, I know it's a bit more difficult if you haven't got a car, because it is really, no, it's not actually on a bus route, but Newstead Abbey was the ancestral home of Lord Byron. You can go around the house and see, a lot of trinkets and memories and things about Lord Byron, and the grounds themselves are well worth sort of walking in and enjoying and things like that. And they've got a flock of peacocks there. I'm not sure if that's right.
Lovely.
Yeah, because Cleo's favourite bird is the peacock, actually. So they've got these peacocks there, and it's a nice place. So that's the ancestral home, Newstead Abbey, which is near Ravenshead, just to the north of Nottingham.
Oh, sorry, definitely check that out.
He was known as a mad, bad, and dangerous person, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. He was indeed, yeah.
Yeah, had a bit of a dodgy upbringing, where his father left home and took all the dosh, and so. But yeah. Anyway, the poem that I chose is "She Walks in Beauty." She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. And all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heavenly to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens over her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express, how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and over that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent.
Very good.
And that was supposedly a female that he met at a funeral, and she was in mourning for, I'm presuming, her husband, but she was a beautifully striking lady, and it inspired him to write that poem.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
On the 11th of June 1814, so it's sort of around about now, many years ago.
It is, yeah, it is indeed. And of course, he was in Greece. He drowned or something. I'm saying he died at a very early age, didn't he, Lord Byron?
Did he die in Greece? I can't remember that.
Or Italy?
He was a revolutionary, wasn't he, in the Greek War of Independence?
It was. It could be Greece. I'm not 100% certain now, to be honest with you. But
yeah, I'd have to look that up. I'll look that up because that's interesting. How he died.
Yeah.
But he was a peer and a politician. I know that.
Yeah, he was.
And his father left when he was very young. Yeah, I think actually, have I got how old he is? No, I haven't. Yeah, I have a feeling it was about 30 odd, I think, was he? Or yeah.
It was something.
Have to look it up.
Yeah. He certainly never got his old age pension. That's the problem.
It's not many did in that era. Yeah. So, what's the plans for next week? Or are you going to have you a poem to write to read, Rob?
I was going to read a Shakespeare poem last week. Actually, I could read that. Mm-hmm. But I can't remember what I read. I read To the Sea by Philip Larkin, and then I read, what else did I read? I think I read something by Blake again last week, but I don't think I read the sonnet. I might read a sonnet by Shakespeare. Let me just go get the book. Mm-hmm. I think, well, it was either Sonnet 8 or Sonnet 14 I've got it written down here. Let me have a look. I think it was Sonnet 8, and the reason why is because one of the things I like, which I think is a little bit out of fashion with poetry now, is actually repetition, where you repeat, and I think Shakespeare used it quite a lot, but I think a lot of people now label it as lazy writing, especially in prose. Like, I'm part of the Write Club Society at the Open University. Sometimes we upload our work into the forum, and I like repetition, so I would use it quite a bit in my work. But one of their arguments is, you shouldn't use repetition. You should find other words for it, because it doesn't make for good reading. It makes it look lazy, which I disagree with completely. Because this is why I like this poem. It's Sonnet 8 by William Shakespeare. Music to hear, why hear'st thou music sadly? Sweets with sweets war not, joy delights in joy. Why lovest thou that which thou receivest not gladly, or else receivest with pleasure thine annoy? If the true concord of well-tuned sounds, by unions married, do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who, all in one pleasing note do sing, whose speechless song, being many, seeming one, sings this to thee, thou single wilt prove none. I mean, if you look here, like the repetition, you've got music to hear, why hear'st thou music sadly? So you've got the repetition of music and hear. The next line is sweets with sweets. There was a really good one. There was, where is it? I lost it. Anyway, I just love that. Good. Yeah. I just love that. Repetition. I love that use of just using the same word over and over again. I don't know why, I just like the sound of it, and I think I can understand why people do see it as lazy writing sometimes, but I don't know. For me, it just sounds good.
Yeah. So you've got about over 150 more to go, actually, Rob.
Yeah.
154 sonnets you wrote, because I don't think that is one of the more popular ones, is it? The one you've written from?
No, it's not.
Well, which is a pity, really, because all of them have got a powerful message, really, isn't it? I'll say. Well, most of them were written to a young man, wasn't they? I'll say most of them were.
Yeah, the first, I think there's about probably around 100 of them around. They think they're written to a young man, and then the other to his mistress, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
but he's good. Like I've been slowly making my way through them. I think I'm up to. I'm only up to like Sonnet 28. But even there, like you can see a lot of the themes that he's always touching on. Beauty and time seem to be very common within Shakespeare. In fact, he's almost obsessed with time. Like the amount of times he goes on about how like the wrinkles in someone's face,
I compare these to a summer's day and things like that, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. So yeah. But yeah, no. That's the only poem I've got. Has anyone else got anything they want to read?
Well, I'll say, just if you like, I'll say I did. What about Dylan Thomas? I'll say Dylan Thomas, of course, drank himself to death, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't 40 when he died. But he did do this very short poem about do not go gentle into that good night, which goes thus. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words have fought no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright, their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they graved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Brave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And that's the end of it. It's a fairly short poem, but probably one of his most famous ones, actually.
Can I ask you a question? You two talk a lot about the authors and about their history and stuff like that. So I'm just curious, do you think when reading a poem, because my approach is sometimes the author, the writer of the poem is actually irrelevant. I'm more bothered about the content of the poem and how it sounds and stuff like that. So there's like this detachment between author, poem, writer and poem. And so I was just wondering, do you guys, when reading your poems, do you think, do you consider the poet? Do you think the poet is, it's important to consider the poet's life and who they were when it comes to reading their poetry? Like, do you think it's essential? Do you think it gives the poem extra meaning or anything like that?
Well, I think it gives it extra meaning. Yeah, I'm sure it does. Because I'm saying Dylan Thomas is, raging against old age, basically. It's something which he didn't get to. He drunk himself and things like that, smoked and all sorts of things. So, yeah, it's quite poignant in that respect that he himself did not get to rage against the dying of the light.
Yeah, exactly.
So from that point of view, it strikes a chord, basically. And I suppose with any other authors as well. So you mentioned Byron, who come to, an untimely end and so on. And, I'll say it expresses their emotions and things like that. And it's all part and parcel of the process of getting to understand people and what they're saying, basically.
Yeah, I agree. It's strange, though, because I'm just rapidly trying to think as well. If I was to read a book, I wouldn't want to really know about the author. But with a poem, I do need to know about the author.
That's very interesting, that is, I think, because that creates even more of a difference between poetry and prose then, doesn't it? So the author, the poet is an extension of the poem, and your argument is that it's important to properly understanding and appreciating the poem, whereas with a novel it's not. You just completely you remove the author. You can remove the author altogether. All it is about the story, really, about the prose.
It's
quite interesting. Yeah. No, I only asked that because, obviously doing English Lit and creative writing at Open University, we touch on literary theory, and obviously there's one that argues that the author is very important, but there's others like formalism, which kind of like completely it just turns around and says, no, the author, the poet is completely irrelevant. All that matters is what's written, and you just take it apart. And it's, so it's interesting to just get other people's opinions on stuff like that. And what you're,
Yeah.
All right then, guys. Should we leave it there then for this week?
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
I think that's great. Yeah. Right, guys. I'll speak to you next week then.
Okay. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, and you too.
Okay. Bye.
I'll speak to you next week then.